sciences or chemistry or something, but also all areas of knowledge. The term is legitimate for those, and that's why even theology used to be considered the queen of the sciences. And so we've had an abdication, as it were, or a theft, one of the two, or maybe a combination in the use of those. I have some remarks here. If anybody ever wants these, I can give you a handout or something for a thumb drive or something, because I'm going to skip through this fairly fast. And I interacted with certain thinkers here that I'm not going to today, but you have a lot of attempt as we move toward our current era in which people rejected the earlier thinking like of Plato and Aristotle and their understandings of truth. That is objective truth versus subjective truth. And I would still maintain a belief in objective truth, although I recognize that when you look at truth, you have to figure out how do I take that truth and work it into my life. So I'm not doubting the question, the importance of making truth work in us, and our reaction to truth, our relation to truth. And so I think that I would not want to try to do away with all of that, but recognize that if there is to be truth, it must be objective first and foremost before I can actually connect to truth and use it in my life. Is truth objective to the person, or is a subjective experience shared by a group, each with his own or home piece of a puzzle of truth? That's where I begin to look at this, particularly as I've been listening to some things, and last night, and I thought, I think people are thinking about truth as a big puzzle. And you have a piece of the puzzle, and you have a piece of the puzzle, and we get all of our pieces of the puzzle together, and we have truth. And so, but actually, if you ever looked at a puzzle part, it doesn't carry a lot of meaning as an individual piece. And it would be inappropriate to say, well, this is the puzzle, or even to say this is the truth. It's only a component of a whole. And I'm going to show you that little illustration in just a moment. It's one I already had here. After having heard the presentation last night, I thought, I hope that's not offensive, but you told me I can be that way. So I thought, I don't know if I want to use that because I don't mean to offend. But we are here just trying to understand together, and so there's no intent of offense. But when I look at the puzzle pieces, I don't think the puzzle pieces are truth themselves. I think they only can be a part of truth, but may be in the wrong puzzle. One of the worst things to do when everybody put puzzles together, one of the worst things you can do is we get a puzzle piece thrown into your box that doesn't relate to that puzzle.
Right.
And you can't fit it in no matter how much you want to. And that's what occurs sometimes when people talk about truth, when what they're talking about really doesn't relate to the objective truth. It relates to something else altogether. And so there are things that happen in the Enlightenment I talk about here, and I'm not going to go into the Enlightenment and talk about the ideas of various thinkers of the time, like Kant or Hegel or whatever. Not Hegel's not Enlightenment, but my mind's going blank. But the Descartes and others at this point who dealt with different issues of truth, that's going to be beyond my conversation. But I do believe that historically, at least in the West, there was an understanding that there are two realities, and they're both true. They both have knowledge. And one is the material universe. Because why? Because the material universe is created by a being outside that universe and brings actually meaning and truth to it. So you have a spiritual reality and a physical reality that both operate, somewhat of a dualism instead of a monism of a sort. And what has taken place, and which I developed somewhat here, is the fact that what began after the time of the Enlightenment and gradually to the present era is a development of a two-story universe in which things relating to religion, faith, sometimes ethics, questions relating to those matters are considered interesting but not significant because they don't relate to a materialistic, naturalistic world. So when you have religion, religion is private, personal, and not significant. Whereas things in the material universe are the things that really matter. And so if you have a public and a private Christian or Buddhist or whatever it may be school, then that is going to be in opposition to those who believe those things are not particularly pertinent. In other words, you're not, you're playing a sub-game. So I think that has to be worked with. But universals and faith is insignificant, and what is in the materialistic world is important. Now, I have a little something here I wrote. Matter of fact, after thinking about this yesterday, that I'm actually going to go. I said the relegation of religion to the unknowable by rationale cause it to be regarded as meaningless, and the lower story is all that really matters. The upper story is private, personal, and based on feelings. We're going to get to that elephant in a minute. Based on feelings, while the lower story is public, objective, and based on facts. This has even moved into the law, where a judge in the Second Circuit indicated that religion, since it concerns faith, may be defined as that which is contrary to reason. So he says it doesn't really matter. Yet such a view would be a rejection of, for example, the writings of the Apostle Paul, who says that faith that does not have evidence is worthless. Or even the teaching of Peter, where he says it's important to develop an answer for the reason of the hope that's within you. So in historic Christian thought, at least, the idea that there are truths, they are objective in themselves. They're not merely something that's contrary to reason. They actually are in comport with reason. Faith, then, at least in the Christian sense, is not a leap of faith or a leap into the dark. I reject that idea. I know where it comes from, and I know how it developed. But I don't think it's a leap of anything. I think it's a step. And there's a lot of difference between a leap and a step. I think faith is a step toward the truth. But I don't think you leap into the dark. And I have an interesting illustration I found from a friend of mine by the name of Norm Geisler, who says this. A person wants to ascend to the top of a building. He pushes the button and 2 elevator doors open. The interior of the first is so totally dark that you cannot even see the floor clearly, and no one gets off of it. The second is well lit, and a large man emerges from it. Which is the safer elevator? Which one provides you with the best evidence that it can get you to the top floor safely? True, it still takes a step of faith to get into the second one. But it is a step of faith in the light of good evidence. The other is a leap of faith in the dark. So I do believe that faith is something that we express that's not an absolute. It's an anticipation of what you hope to be at the other side, so to speak. But it's not a jump. It's based on reasonable evidence. And that's what I would say faith is properly called. I would say, which elevator would you take? And that gives rise to how we should deal with this. So, let's talk about the 6 blind men and the elephant. This was discussed last night. You have 6 blind men. Look at this. You've got a fan, a wall, a rope, a tree, a spear, and a snake. And supposedly this reflects the fact that when you have a truth, each group has sort of a piece of it. But I would suggest it says something quite different, because each of the 6 are wrong. Because if they were seeing, they would see a whole that is made up of parts. The whole is greater than the parts. So there's no teaching of different truths here. It's simply saying that all are wrong about truth. They all hold falsehoods. If they have their eyes open, then they in fact would see the totality and see that that is not really a spear at all. It's a tusk. And I think that's how we have to deal with the concept of truth. Can a truth statement be made of many truths held by various people and yet be in contradiction? And I would say no. What is truth? Truth is that which corresponds to its object. It corresponds to reality. It accurately expresses an actual state of affairs. That is truth. Now, the question of what truth is objectively to me and how I relate to that truth are 2 different issues. I may look at the truth and don't like it. I may reject it because I think it contradicts another truth, or I may do something with it, but I think that truth is in fact objective in nature. A truth statement matches its object. For example, here's a table. See, it matches what it is. If I say that's a table, it actually is a table, not something other than a table. The law of non-contradiction helps us to discover truth. For example, opposite ideas cannot both be true at the same time in the same sense. The earth is round and the earth is not round are opposites. Now, unless you want to say it's not in the same way at the same time, and you say that, let's say this is a picture of the earth on an atlas or something, or on a wall, and so it's flat, it's not really depicting the true earth, but a representation. That's another question. But the realities of the earth, if they're round, are not round. So, there are several objections to the idea of objective truth. And one is that there are no absolute truths. There's no such thing as truth. You can't know it. No, all truth is relative. It's true for you, but not for me. No one has the truth, or all truth depends on your perspective. These are all ways in which people relate to objective truth. I would say the third law of logic, which is Aristotle's law, and he didn't invent this, by the way, he just articulated it. It existed prior to Aristotle. People were operating, is by applying a claim to itself. For example, if a person says there are no absolutes, the response is, are you absolutely sure about that? Which indicates there is an absolute. Or there is no truth, and the response is, well, is that true? Self-refuting. You can't know the truth. Then how do you know that? See, if you can't know it. All truth is relative. Is that a relative truth? It's true for you but not for me. Is that just true for you, or is it true for everybody? So the fact is, you have self-defeat in the whole concept of trying to make truth subjective versus objective. So the case of the blind men, truth is not relative to the individual, otherwise we wouldn't even know the blind men were mistaken. Someone has to have a sense of understanding the whole and understanding what the parts really are. And I just had difficulty when I was talking to some people once about the fact, well, we all have this individual truth in us, and we can define our reality. Well, I'm saying, well, that really is a difficult problem when you have, for example, a number of people who all have their individual truths. When you try to operate it in the real world, it doesn't operate that way. We have to actually embrace the idea of objectivity. So the Enlightenment changed the relationship of God to nature, initiated a move among some to see the world in a two-tier paradigm, and I've mentioned that. And what has happened is that we've talked about this idea of subjective truth versus objective, that those in a public setting would say, is science truth? They would say, well, yes, it's true, because it, in fact, is the matter of the world. That is all that exists. And so they can do experiments, they can do testings, and they would say these things have real meaning, whereas those things that are not within the public sphere are, in fact, are something that you just hold individually, and it doesn't have any import on what we're doing. So I think what you have to do is move people away from certain myths, even in the science world. There are many people who have been working on this, but for example, here's a myth that was perpetrated, I think, by some people who want to argue a naturalistic view as they try to discredit Western Christianity. And the fact is that, well, people believe the world was flat, we know better now. Except that nobody believed the world was flat. and the fact is, you have a lot of things that are perpetrated as being real, but actually they are fictions that have developed over the last century. For example, was the Roman Catholic Church against Galileo? Not per se, not really. It's a totally different question was going on there. And the debate on whether you should work in the idea of a alternative view, or whether you're saying this is the absolute view. And you find that Roman Catholicism, which I'm not Roman Catholic, but nonetheless, for centuries, was a heavy supporter of scientific endeavor. Both people in the various orders were going to school, developing science, getting their major training. The church was putting money and time and people into scientific discoveries, and you have for centuries ideas of science coming out of a Western mindset. So let me move ahead here, because I'm aware of my time. How do we know then what we think we know? How do we come to that? Well, here's a little thing. What is knowledge, first of all? Simply put, knowledge is justified, true belief. See, for knowledge is what? It's science. That's what the word means. So what is science? What is knowledge? It's that which is believed, it's true, and it has evidence that backs it up. Do some people know while others only believe? For example, some people would say scientists know the truth, but theologians or people of faith only believe it. Is that really true? True or false? The question is, what is belief? Now, belief, as you well know, is related to the concept of faith. In other words, what does it mean to believe something? You say you believe something, what does that mean? Faith is believing what is contrary to the evidence. That's another view, and I gave you that from the judge who actually said that. Faith is believing what we cannot prove. For example, if you have faith, can anything be proved in reference to your faith position? Or is it just up for grabs? Well, if you believe that faith is not merely speculation, if you believe that faith is not merely a shot in the dark, but you believe that faith is something that actually relates to reasonable evidence. For example, if I had somehow a belief system that said, I believe that my car can run 150 miles an hour, and it can do maybe 100, my faith position has been compromised. But you have to have evidence that backs up a belief. It can't be just simply out in the air. Two aspects to belief. One is subjective, the other is objective. For example, one aspect of belief, and which is sometimes what we mean, is that it's conviction. We have convictions. Lots of people believe lots of things. They are very convinced about it. But belief is not merely a conviction. Belief is also content. What is believed? I believe that. Any belief, thought that we talk about, any faith position that we hold, must have content. It is the kernel of what is it that I embrace by my internal. It's my subjective embracing an objective. The content of a belief is expressed then in a proposition. I believe that, and here I've got some options here. I believe that Oregon is beautiful. Anybody been there? I believe it, but you might not. But I believe that it's beautiful, which is aesthetic in nature. Thomas Jefferson was the primary author of the Declaration of Independence. I believe that. I was not there. Matter of fact, hardly anything in history, unless it's very, very recent, I wasn't there. And yet historians were constantly operating in the fact that things that happen and are recorded things that are recorded actually did happen, but you have to have reasons why you believe that. Okay? That's a whole big discussion about the fact of even the Bible, whether it be the Hebrew Scriptures or the New Testament, Christian Scriptures. Do you believe those things? Well, is there a reason for it? There must be evidence. It can't be merely your feelings about it. So there is objectivity, I think, we have to look at. Octavian Augustus Caesar was emperor of the Roman Empire when Jesus was born. Well, first of all, you have to believe that Jesus was born. That's one question. Was there a historical Jesus? Almost all scholars, whether they be what we might call liberal, conservative, Christian, or non-Christian, almost everyone agrees with that, based on the fact there's a lot of historical evidence that if we're used with any other figure in history, nobody would even question. So it's reasonable to believe that, but the question is, was this person emperor at that time? That's a historical fact. Here's another one, scientific fact. Babies emit brain waves in the first few weeks after conception. Now, how would you know that or not? Well, you can test it. And if you say that I believe that, if you can reasonably demonstrate it, then your faith has stepped you toward truth, but I don't want to say it's a leap. See, I'm resisting that idea. I don't think we go in the dark. I think we have light, and evidence is there, and there's a reason why we can believe it, because there is evidence. And that is actually a truth scientifically. God is an infinite and personal being who created the universe. That's a theological fact. Now, not everybody agrees with that. And that's okay. People do differ. But then the reason why you believe something should be because you have some evidence for your argument. Propositions addressing the objective content of a belief, then, are truth claims. I believe that what I say is a truth claim. Now, you may not agree with the truth claim. That's okay. That's where we can have our conversation. And the reasons why we either accept it or reject it. But what are truth claims? All people have an innumerable number of beliefs, even beliefs that they have never consciously considered. You know that? Each of us have beliefs that we haven't thought about. We just move in the world and operate because we can't spend our time thinking through all of these things. So we consider them. Here's some unconsidered beliefs. I believe the elevator into which I'm about to step has cords that are strong enough to hold the weight of all those on board. You ever wonder about that? Particularly as they just keep loading in? Well, we step in and we push the button and we believe that we're going to actually arrive at the bottom, not at a very fast pace. See, we're going to get off the elevator again. But that's unconsidered belief. Usually we operate daily on beliefs like that. Here's another one. I believe that I was actually born to my mother and father with whom I reside rather than belonging to someone else and having been kidnapped from the hospital. How many people have actually checked this out carefully? We believe some things without actually going into great depth. Because we see certain factors, we've learned the people, we think, well, they wouldn't be stealing me from the hospital from someone who... But you know what? There are actually people that have been stolen. And they thought they were the right person. So the fact is that we can have beliefs that have not actually been carefully considered. Here's one. I believe the books of the Bible are the ones that should be included in the canon of Scripture to be read and followed. I guarantee you most people, whether it be in whatever religious faith you have, and your sacred books, have probably not done the study about where these things came from. I always joke with people, I said, some of you think that the angels deliver them to the bookstores. But that's not what happened. You know, why do you believe that this is in fact what we say it is? And it's something that has to be considered. These are unconsidered. All people then hold false beliefs. And I probably hold false beliefs. Not many. I rarely have that problem. But we may hold false beliefs. And the reason why sometimes is that we have never really examined it to see whether it's true. I would say for you, because I've talked to a lot of people in the historical world, in the scientific world, and we've discussed questions. And it's amazing how scientists who claim to be almost the quintessential individuals who have knowledge about things have never examined a lot of reasons why they say what they do. It's not all as obvious as it may appear. People hold false beliefs, even scholars. Truth is that which corresponds to reality, is what I would view. That's a correspondence view. So you have three basic views. There are others, but these are the three basic views. One says truth is that which corresponds to reality, what is known in the world. In other words, truth has to comport with, in fact, what I speak about. In other words, if I say this is a computer, it can't be a horse. In other words, it has to be a correspondence with what reality is. And in some respects, and I wish I had time about it, this relates to questions of epistemology and ontology. The fact is, why is something what it is and not something else? Those are interesting questions. Another view is called the coherence view. That is, truth is that which is coherent with other personal views, whether or not it's in agreement with objective reality. In our coherence view, if we all agree together that certain things are true, without ever actually going through the research and the studies about whether it conforms to reality, as long as it's consistent with what we've been arguing, even if it weren't initially true, it follows a coherence perspective. And obviously you're familiar with the third one, which is pragmatic. Whatever works is true. That is, that which seems to meet the need is true. Those are three views. I would hold, in fact, to the first one. Not everybody would. The fact that a person believes a proposition does not ensure that he or she has knowledge. There is a difference between knowledge and belief. If a truth is known, it's necessarily believed in truth, but simply believing a proposition does not make that proposition either known or true. For example, if I said, I have a friend of mine I know right now in the United States is asleep. Do I know that? Well, maybe they're wide awake. So really, if I say that they're asleep, and I make that as a claim, and they're actually awake, I don't really have the knowledge. I can believe it, though, but I can go through a thing by calling and ask them. I said, where are you? I was asleep in bed until you called. I said, a moment ago I spoke the truth. See, because I have those things that comport. So I think this is the issue of knowledge and truth. So truth and knowledge and belief all have together, but justifications, evidence, truth, that which conforms to reality, beliefs, those things that we hold sincerely by conviction and by our propositions. How do truth and justification relate then? That is, simply believing something that happens to be true does not constitute knowledge. Correspondence of belief and truth alone does not constitute it. In order to have a genuine knowledge, we must have justification, proof, facts, evidence. That's one thing I have problems with, fact is subjective truth. I picked this from David Letterman. I actually like him, but this is nonsense. He says there's only one requirement for any of us, and that is to be courageous. First of all, how do we know that's true? I have a question on that. But he has courage as being the big one. If you're really courage, that's good. Because courage, as you might know, defines all of the human behavior, and I believe, now we move to believe that, because I've done a little of this myself, pretending to be courageous is as good as the real thing. And I read that and I thought, I hope this guy does never teach anywhere. Oh no, he does it on television, right? And so here's the kind of thinking, the muddled thinking that people get into, that pretending now to be courageous is the same thing as courageous, and yet, in fact, that is, in fact, the most important thing for us. This is called gobbledygook. People do that. Justification is a logical link between belief and truth, and I'm moving on, so I'm going to move here. I had this in Joel Osteen. Anybody know who Joel Osteen is? I got to admit, when I read this, I thought, okay, there's another one. Here's a guy who believes and believes and believes and believes, and he has no clue what he's talking about. Well, I'll just move on. I was going to analyze that for you a little bit, but you can probably see it. That is, belief must be rational. So I want us to recognize, I think that faith can lead us to truth, but it's a step away, not a yard away. We have to have evidence to believe something to be true. Now, here are the points of evidence. I think it comes from logic. Certain things are based on logic, like math. Some things are based on experience. I think you can truly experience something. It doesn't have to be logical. I'm experiencing being with you. I think I have reason to believe I'm not somewhere else. Okay? My experience, something, for example, a basic belief like a priori. I don't think I have to defend everything we can have. So these are ways in which we deal with the fact of truth. Now, to sort of sum that up then with recognizing I kept within my 30 minutes of this, and then we'll have Q&A, let me just simply say that I think that in order to converse with people as I have, we have to set the ground rules and be sure that we're speaking the same language between the two schools of thought. So maybe I'll just stop there and then we can have Q&A.
Yes. A student comes to you and asks you a very simple question. Is God good or not? What do you tell him? I know that he is good. It's rational that he is good. I know from experience that he is good.
Okay.
I think that every answer you'll give him will land you in a trap.
It could, unless he doesn't allow me another step. Because I can deal with the fact that God is good, but then the question is, are you bad? Are you good? And the question, what situation do you find yourself in? If you assume that God has to make everything good to be good, then there would never be bad, right?
Okay.
That doesn't help, I suppose. I don't sense that. Not every question can be answered in a satisfactory way to someone, but that does not mean, on the other hand, that what you say isn't true. You don't have to say, I've had enough students. You have to satisfy a student's question. It doesn't make you wrong. There may be other factors in their life that make them think the way they do.
But on the way of, this is what you tell yourself, but what do you tell the student? You tell yourself that the fact that you cannot answer the student does not mean that I am wrong. Okay. But what do you tell the student?
I give him my book on the problem of pain. Because, because I did one of that. Where's God when it hurts? So I think what you have to do, though, is you can't take a simple question like that and answer it without developing other ideas.
Right.
I think, okay, let's have you come in and talk to me every week, and let's talk about different questions, and then let's address that first question several sessions later.
Okay.
That was a lovely way to start. And by continuation of the starting, I just wanted to pick up on this, the blind man and the elephant parable, because it keeps popping up, and Dajok will definitely recognize where this comes from. I want to make sure that we're understanding it in the way that it was taught. So Lord Buddha taught this in the Udana, I think it's 6, well, I've written it down, 668, 69 is where I remember it from. And it's actually a parable designed to show how the scholars of the age, i.e. the Hindus, the scholars of the age were wrangling about nonsense because they could not see the truth. Okay. He could see the truth, and he closes with, how they cling and wrangle, some who claim for preach and monk, they're basically looking for their name. For quarreling, each to his view they cling, such, such fools see only one side of a thing.
So actually,
that's
I'm not in
actually-
disagreement with that.
Exactly. This
Yeah.
is what I was saying. This is why we need to be careful of the usage of that parable,
Yeah.
because it was supposed to show the uselessness of wrangling.
Yeah, and I would agree. Yeah,
Yeah,
And clinging to view.
exactly.
that's good.
I wanted to go back to the question posed by Shakti.
Yes.
And that's where I think apophatic and cataphatic
Correct.
understandings come in.
Exactly.
Mhm.
And you can answer the student in that way,
Yeah.
using one and the other.
You know, I don't disagree with that, I'm not. I think you are empathetic with the person, for example. But all I was saying is that if they truly want an answer to that, I can't answer it immediately as to the answer. I can say, I understand you have a question and there's a concern. So yes, you pull them aside, but that's why I say we need to spend time together for us to work through this question together. But I do think there's an answer.
John. Two questions. When you identify knowledge with justified true belief, Plato deals with that problem in the Sophist, and he rejects the idea that knowledge is justified true belief because it doesn't make any sense out of the Greek understanding of noesis, which is an intuitive understanding of the truths of things. And the intuitive understanding is a grasp of something without the ability to give evidence because it's self-evident. For example, mathematical axioms like A plus B equals B plus A. You either see that that's true or you don't, but you can't justify your belief of it. You can exemplify it, but you can't justify it. So one of the problems, and I'd like to ask you, is if you restrict knowledge to what is justified in terms of evidence and arguments, what do you do with the capacity for intuitive knowledge? Which, by the way, all of our sensory experience is ultimately intuitive as
Yeah.
well.
But remember, that's why I said there are different forms of evidence in my view. When I say justified true belief, I'm not questioning that. We have direct knowledge. I mean, you're in front of me and I'm in front of you. I don't have to go into a big discussion on that. It is, in fact, that way. But it nonetheless is the evidence. All I'm arguing is that true knowledge comes as faith comes into contact with evidence. It's not something that is beyond our capability.
Okay, but when you call it rational, at the end of every Eucharistic liturgy, in those Christian traditions which have an understanding of the Eucharist, which the consecrated elements have the real presence of the body and blood of Christ,
Mm-hmm.
there's a prayer at the conclusion of that in the Orthodox Church in which the faithful say, I believe that this is truly your own precious body and truly your own precious blood, addressed towards the consecrated bread and wine. Now, if I were to give evidence for that, and somebody were to say to give rational evidence, I want to know what parameters you mean by rational, because rational in any sense that I would understand it in terms of a set of concepts and forms of argumentation, it's almost impossible to get that sort of rational evidence.
But I'm not speaking of rationalism. I'm speaking of the fact that the mind must be involved in the process. The reason has to be involved. For example, you take the fact, it's a theological truth. It's like I can't prove to you the doctrine of the Trinity or many other questions. But if in fact I have a reason that I go from, and it's not merely guesswork, it's not merely a statement I make without a rationale behind it. When I look at Scripture, I have a rationale because I accept the book as having value and truth, and because of that, anybody who works with Scripture, and I'm sure the same is true with other beliefs systems also, you use that as a basis of argument just like you would anything else. We have to come from someplace. We have to start somewhere. We have to stand somewhere. And I have no problem with the fact if a person argues, I believe based on what I believe in these systems, that, for example, the body and blood of Christ is in the Eucharist. Okay. That's where you're coming from. I might not agree with it, but at least I see you're following a process of thinking. See, you haven't devoted your mind in that. I've heard you give an argument. I thought that's good.
Okay.
Would you agree that in every idea that we can say, okay, this is a rational idea that I have, and when I communicate that, when I try to explain to other people in a rational, logical way, would you agree that whatever the words I am using, what I try to do to the other person is to provide the other person means to have the same, let's call it intuition, or the same immediate perception that the thing is, immediate perception of the same reality that you also experienced.
Well, now you're moving actually into the whole question of epistemology and hermeneutics and areas that I like a lot. The fact is, what you try to do in any statement that you make, I mean, I attempted to even do it in my talk, whether I was successful or not, in which you try to state words in certain ways that people can understand what you're saying. And obviously, you want to bring them into your statement and understanding. That's what you want to do in a book. You want to pull a person into your thinking processes. So, and when I use the word rational, I'm using it in contrast to irrational. Irrational sees an absolute contradiction in the world. I don't see a contradiction. I see difficulties, but I don't see contradictions, because direct contradictions I don't consider to be valid. So yes, you try to make yourself and what you're thinking and feeling, you try to make it understandable by using the right words to do so. And what happens is that when you're writing a book, and some of you have done this, you know what you do. You go back and say, boy, I need to restate that because it really doesn't quite get to what I'm thinking. And so you have to rephrase it because you're trying to do the very thing you're saying. You try to bring the person into your experience and to your understanding. The author is the one who brings the meaning to the text. And my job is to then get on board with what the author's meaning is and enter into that experience with it.
Daniel?
As I was listening to your presentation, a number of your points about objective truth examples reminded me of examples that R.M. Hare and Basil Mitchell used when they responded to Antony Flou's paper, Theology and Falsification. He said, look, not all of the things that we believe, not all the beliefs that we cherish about who we are, our relation with other people, our basic safety in the world, in your elevator example, are demonstrable or provable or rational in the sense that we normally associate with the sciences.
Mm-hmm.
And therefore, they turn Flou's argument on its head. Flou says theological beliefs are not falsifiable and therefore they can't be true. And they say, no, there are many beliefs in the world that we accept as true or we accept as justified even though they're not falsifiable. So I wonder if the distinction between falsifiable and unfalsifiable would further the paradigm that you presented in terms of not just what makes something true, but if there are different ways of presenting or representing various kinds of true beliefs.
Well, that's a good observation, I think. Not everything we can say can obviously be demonstrated, right? But I would say that what you said about falsifiability in, let's say, theology or philosophy or whatever is also true in the sciences. There are many things in the sciences in which portions seem to work and others don't. And I don't want to get into this debate, but that's one of my major problems with Darwinian thought, is because it is not truly falsifiable. And so it has to be observable, falsifiable. It has to reflect evidence that we may not actually have access to right now. And yet people take the jump, as it were. I know I can't demonstrate it because I have all these problems, but I believe it anyway. Well, see, the very claims they would make against a person of faith is the very thing that they do also. Because it's not, even though I hold this view, I recognize you can't solve every problem. And not everything works that way, but you have to make a decision where you want to stand to be able to function. Or you just sort of stop what you're doing, right? Because I haven't got it all worked out yet. That's what you keep working on. Does that make sense? So I see the problems in both. And if both groups would agree with these things, we'd have less problems. Okay, we're both trying to work it out.
But sometimes we work it out differently, meaning scientists and theologians work out their problems differently, and it may be that there's a different mode of rationality at work in the sciences than there is in religion.
Well, yeah, you don't do chemical experiences, for example, but then again, that's only one form of gaining knowledge. I mean, that doesn't invalidate another form that might be just as valid. And I'm not going to say much about this because it's in process right now with a bunch of people. But I've done a couple of books in the area of science and issues, and I'm working with a number of people right now on the question of how do I say this? Dealing with the whole question of Darwinianism and the question of relevance to science, because Darwinian thought is different than evolutionary thought, because Darwinian thought is a way of interpreting philosophically certain factors. It's not really a scientific way of dealing with it, and yet people have not distinguished between the actual relationship of the philosophy to the actual scientific investigation, and they assume they're the same thing, and they're not. But we do the same thing sometimes. We just have to be aware that what we're doing, and then we can try to figure out the problems and how to. You're not going to solve everything, but so what I'm saying in general, this is where you have to function.
Thank you. Rav Shabtai.
Just one point about the parable of the elephant. You cannot leave it. I would say that the parable goes on, the problem goes on forever. Because if now we are very smart, we are very brilliant, we know it's an elephant. Then ask you what an elephant is. You ask Hannibal or the Syrian army in the 1st century AD, what is an elephant? Say a tank. And you say, what's an elephant? An amazing animal from the prehistoric time that survived nowadays and demonstrates, something in the creation. So the six blind men will not finish wrangling by deciding it's an elephant. Okay, wonderful, you gave it a name. You didn't solve anything. You didn't explain what an elephant is. It's still something crazy, something, it's not a cow, it's not a person, it's something which is
let me respond
strange.
to that. But that's an ontological question. You can name something anything you want. I could call this a car, what you name something doesn't make it what it is. It merely is a code we use so we can intelligently understand each other and share meaning together. But what something is inherently, I always tell students, is what is it that makes something what it is and not something else. That's what it's all about. And then whatever that is, I name it something so we can talk about it. So you can call it 100 things. The question is, describe it to me, and then we can talk about it.
Is this what you want?
Not only that, but because you can use the elephant in many different ways, it does not diminishes what the elephant is. The elephant is an elephant. But then you can say, okay, but I can apply to this and this and this. I can do with this. It has some potentialities. It can be an animal in the zoo. It can be a tank. It can be food. It can be just some curious thing. It can be a place for me to take pictures, whatever. But still, these are all potentialities of the elephant that will depend, of course, on how I will interact with it. But still, it does not diminish what the substance of the elephant is.
But ontologically, see, the question of function, the question of nature is different. For example, this right here is a bottle. Right now it holds water. I could put something in here and blow up a house, right? I could take this and use it to hit you on the head. I could take it possibly and put a piece of glass in here, it changes nature incidentally, not essentially, and use it to be a spyglass. I mean, the point of it is, what something is ontologically in its function is incidental to the nature of it. Because I could use a hammer to kill people with, or I could use it to build a house. So function is not what describes the nature of something. Okay?
No, that's
okay. So there's a distinction between essential and incidentals.
Yeah.
May I just throw, I know I'm not supposed to be here participating, but it's unconditional. Naming something is unconditional of what it actually is. And that's something you teach as well. It doesn't matter what we think what it is. It remains to be the same what it is.
Of course, 100% right. That's what, if all I'm interested in name, but if we are talking about faith and about things that we have to conclude and about to have faith, to call it a name and put the name in a box and lock the box and throw it away is not very useful. The thing is, we have faith, what do we do with it? And here is the question. So when we say that there are diverse opinions of what faith is, it's very good. You call it faith and we finish. You call it a name and Ricardo will be very happy. Faith is faith no matter what we do with it. but the thing is, I think we sit here, our real concern is what to do with it. And everyone has a still, after the parable of the 6 people, every blind person or every person with eyes will have a different answer what to do with it. And this is the crucial question.
But once they are able to actually see the elephant, they'll have a better idea of what to do with it, or at least how to escape it.
But even the Apostle Paul writes that you can't see the elephant, right? And he calls his own arguments into question by saying that he sees through glass darkly.
Okay, well, that
And-
we can discuss that. I've got a whole paper on that issue. So
He's got a book on that one too.
I was at Corinth looking at a mirror when I began to operate on this. So we'll talk.
No. Well, Roy, you don't want. We have 7 more minutes. So
Really, I was told 45. I thought, or that was how long I was to talk.
The question is what to do with the time. You see, we call it.
I was watching this to be so careful with my time.
Brahmachari wants to say something.
Well, I had a follow-on thought from this elephant. This elephant is popping up everywhere. So
It's the elephant in the room, isn't
exactly, I thought I'd let this elephant roam in the jungles that it was intended. Actually, the question of epistemology is the basis upon which all 3 major Indian religions focused their attempts at dialogue. They basically sat down, and as you were talking about positive and negative concomitants and universals, in order to get to the business of what makes something something, you get to this very basic conclusion that we agree on what makes something something and not the other thing, based on convention. Human convention is a convention of language. And it has to be demonstrable. If you're testing it, it has to be reproducible, etc., etc. But Buddhism is Buddhism, Jainism is Jainism, and Hinduism is Hinduism, because we agreed that our bases where we start are a little bit different. We can talk about it using the same language, but they're a little bit different. And they said, well, if your teacher is this enlightened one, we will respect you and your teacher, but we have our little bit of a different view on this subject matter. I wonder, is that way a way of going forward with modern interfaith? What would be your opinion on that?
Oh, that's an interesting view. But there's a sense in which we do that even in Christianity and other groups. I mean, we agree among certain opponents that we don't fully agree on these matters, and yet we hold that which is sufficiently common to us that we can set aside these differences that I always say incidentals versus essentials.
Right.
If you have an essential difference, sometimes it's difficult. If you have an incidental difference, it's okay.
Mm-hmm.
So you can do the same thing if you can find a point at which you have agreement.
Mm-hmm.
And say, let's go with what we have and work on the rest.
So are you talking about agreement about a description about the nature of reality?
Well, there has to be some basis upon which to move forward. So I'm just listening to what he said, and I found that intriguing, that you find those points at which you can say, on this point, as we're talking, we seem to be in agreement. Let's work on that agreement instead of working on the disagreement. Am I right?
I think so.
Yeah.
At least, yeah.
Am I understanding you correctly? Not whether I'm correct.
Yeah, I think you've understood that.
Shaku's not certain there.
Well, I think that there's, I think that there's the effort to come to agreement about the nature of reality.
Mhm.
Say, okay, we nailed it, right? We agree on this. And the other is the journey together,
Oh, that's a
and
good question.
how that journey together we share certain common values.
Mhm.
So to me, there's a different way of finding agreement.
Well, you're going to find. I hate to be doing a lot of talking.
But
You're,
it's your time. So
I know, but I still don't like to monopolize. I was trying to rush through this thing. I think you can find within a broader, let's take a broad scope of individual ideas, and we can agree on this idea, this idea, this idea. We don't have to agree on all the ideas. We just have to find enough that we can have a dialogue to talk about it, and then we can move on to the other question. Because it can be, at least in my experience in negotiation, that I worked, guys, I know, a lawyer, all that kind of junk, that the fact is, if you can find points of connection, then you work on those. You find sometimes the other things you thought were problems don't end up being that.
Did I understand you correctly?
Yes.
We have John.
Just one other question, apropos to what you said, with the different starting points for Buddhism and Hinduism and so forth. When I used to teach Plato and Aristotle, it always struck me that when Aristotle looks out in the world, he sees this man, this horse, and this cow. He looks out in the world and sees a world of substances. He's sort of wired that way. When Plato looks out in the world, he sees a world that's extraordinarily filled with flux, and he needs to find a sense of structure. And one of the problems with Plato and Aristotle is, at some point, they seem to rest on two fundamentally root experiences of the world. And sometimes I wonder if what the history of philosophy, rather than a scheme of different takes on objective truth, which it's said to be, are rather like the history of music, in which when you understand Beethoven's music, it comes out of a certain way of framing what he wants to say in terms of his own experience of reality. It's not just subjective, but his way of expressing the world is fundamentally different from that of Stravinsky. Stravinsky can't say what he needs to say in the framework that Beethoven said what he needed to say, and what Beethoven needed to say was fundamentally different from what Bach needed to say. Bach had sort of run the course. And sometimes I wonder if underlying these various ways in which we view the world or talk about reality, and I'm still not clear what that is, but I'm a philosopher, so you'll have to forgive me. If there are certain root experiences that we have that are ways in which we view the world, that frame the ways in which we see things, that cause certain incommensurabilities between us that are not resolvable by some sort of meta-rational analytic, but we move in sort of different worlds in which we can communicate across them. But still there's a depth of experience that's, again, intuitive in a sense, that may make it very difficult to reach things because they represent, again, in the history of music, fundamentally different sort of open ways in which the world presents itself to people.
Thank you.
And I know that runs into problems with correspondence theory of truth, but as I've taught philosophy over the years, it seems to be at the bottom of a lot of what's going on.
Great, thank you. So now we almost fill the 7 minutes. Do you want
Just
to
comment? A short comment to what Jacques said. I think you said that the values lead you to find the nature of reality. You know, people usually think it's the opposite. Nature of reality brings values. And actually this is what you said, John, that the values that pre-exist in you dictate somehow, tell you somehow how you see the nature of reality. And I think it's a very crucial point. And let's say if we want to have language together, I think if we understand what values are, we went a long way. If we understand really, sharing the values is almost impossible, but just understanding what we are talking about, we mean values, something extremely personal, something that grew, like you said, within us, and we were wired this way. This will help us tremendously to have a dialogue, because then we are not talking about maybe the same reality, but something much deeper than that. You know, the table is a table, okay, but what is a table? And is a table is a place to live. Will we get lunch on this table or not? Or how does the table play in the structure of things? This is a very strong point that I think the dialogue will develop to show. And thank you so much, Sandesh. Yes. 5 דקות הפסקה?
I want to set up the
מה?
I want to set up the presentation.
Okay. So in 5 minutes, but okay.
I'd love to have a few minutes on the side. So
But let's agree on what 5 minutes is.
Everything else is fine.
I thought I was listening to it.